Hi everyone, this is Dr. Kingston, and in this video we will be talking about the arterial supply of the brain. Our objective for this video is to identify the two main arteries supplying the brain and discuss the clinical importance of the cerebral arterial circle, also known as the circle of Willis. So our brains are not only very important, but they're also very large, and that demands really quite a large and fail-safe blood supply to keep it functioning. So we have two sources of arterial blood to the brain, and these both take slightly different courses up through the neck to enter into the cranium. Anteriorly, we have the internal carotid artery, so I'm going to indicate right here. This is a branch of the common carotid artery, which on the left side is a direct branch right off the aorta, and on the right comes off what's called the brachiocephalic artery. That is then going to split into internal and external branches in the neck, and the internal continues up into the cranium through the carotid canal. Posteriorly here we have the vertebral artery, and the vertebral artery is a branch of the subclavian artery, which also comes off the aorta here or off the brachiocephalic again on the right. This is going to ascend the neck by traveling through these little holes on the cervical vertebrae called transverse foramina, okay, because they're on the transverse processes. You will see these in more detail next week. So the vertebral artery ascends through the transverse foramina of vertebrae 1 through 6, and it's going to pass into the cranium through the foramen magnum along with the spinal cord. Once they're inside the cranial cavity, both the internal carotid and the vertebral arteries give off a number of branches that interconnect in various ways. We call these connections between arteries an anastomosis. And just to be clear, an anastomosis can be any blood vessels that join together, not just arteries. But here specifically, we're looking at arterial anastomoses. Anastomoses are really important as sources of collateral blood flow. So if a blockage were to occur somewhere along the ICA, blood could still flow into these branches by coming up through the vertebral artery and traveling through some of these anastomotic branches as such. All right, in the case of the internal carotid, the ICA, and the vertebral arteries, the specific anastomosis here between the anterior and posterior branches is this posterior communicating branch. Okay, and there's one of those on each side. Everything that I'm showing you here is going to be bilateral for the most part. So let's go ahead and start naming these branches and talking about the regions that they supply. We'll start with branches from the ICA, which you can find here on the diagram. Okay, so this guy and that guy, and here on the photo. Okay, it'll be helpful for you to follow along on both. All right. So the first branch off the internal carotid is the ophthalmic artery. And just because I said you can follow along on both, we can't actually see this on the photographic image. There's a very small artery that branches off and travels with the optic nerve into the orbit to supply the eye and the extraocular structures. The next branch here is going to be the middle cerebral artery. And the middle cerebral artery, as you can see on the photograph here, is going to run up in this little crack between the temporal and frontal lobes to serve that middle part of the cerebrum, just like its name says. All right, next we have the anterior cerebral. These are not very creatively named either, which makes for good directions, right? All right, so we've got our anterior cerebral, which is a little bit L-shaped. Okay, so it comes off the internal carotid and travels anteriorly into this longitudinal fissure, and it's going to come up and wrap around the corpus callosum as it supplies this anterior portion of the cerebrum. Between the right and left anterior cerebral artery, we have this teeny tiny baby little branch here called the anterior communicating. So this is a nice anastomosis between right and left parts of the brain, as well as the one we see back here for anterior and posterior parts of the brain. Okay, and that anastomosis between the anterior and posterior supply here is that posterior communicating branch, which comes from the ICA and is going to anastomose with some branches of the vertebral arteries back here. All right, I'm going to clear the field here before we start labeling vertebral branches, just because it gets a little bit clustered. So our vertebral arteries in this image here, we've got them back here on the diagram, and here's one on the photo, and there is the other. So you note here, these are actually quite different in size, and this is really not unusual. There can be a lot of variation in the shape and size of these vessels. All right, so the first branch off the vertebral artery is the posterior inferior cerebellar artery, or the pica, and that serves exactly where its name says, the posterior and inferior portion of the cerebellum. Then we have something a little bit interesting happening here. So the anterior spinal arteries, one comes off the right, one comes off the left, and they join together into this very small vessel that runs on the anterior surface of the spinal cord along its length. Okay, so these don't just supply the brain, they're also supplying part of the spinal cord. All right, and then the vertebral arteries decide they don't want to be separate anymore. They need to be together, and they form basilar artery that is going to run up on the anterior surface of the pons here. Okay, so this is vertebral joined together to form basilar. And the basilar artery then is going to give off a number of other branches that supply the brain. So here we have the anterior inferior cerebral. We have the superior cerebellar. And finally, the posterior cerebral. Okay, and remember that posterior cerebral is going to give off the posterior communicating branch that hooks this whole apparatus up with branches of the ICA. All right, when we put everything together and put labels on everything, this is what we end up with. And like I said, it's a little bit cluttered, not very pretty to look at, but this is an image I wanted you to have to be able to screenshot if you'd like. So you've got one key to naming all of these different blood vessels as you are studying. All right, so having looked at this illustration for several slides now, I'm pretty sure you have already noticed that the internal carotid and cerebral arteries create a circle of collateral blood flow. All right, this provides connections between the anterior and posterior arterial sources. So that posterior communicating branch again connects the ICA back to branches of the vertebral artery posteriorly. And it also links flow between the right and left sides via the anterior communicating branch and the posterior cerebral arteries via the basilar artery. All right, this cerebral arterial circle is also called the circle of Willis. We try to stay away from eponyms, but this is one of those that's so famous most people just know it as the circle of Willis. This is going to create a really robust collateral blood flow for these vessels. So you could have a blockage form anywhere on the circle, and blood would still be able to travel to the branches beyond it just by taking one of these alternative pathways. While that collateral blood flow is a really good fail-safe for blockages, it does come with a price. And the price here is that the cerebral arterial circle is a very common site for the development of saccular or berry aneurysms. A saccular aneurysm is essentially the weakening of a vascular wall such that it balloons out into a sac. So that's where the name comes from. This happens especially frequently in areas where blood traveling inside of vessels changes speed or changes direction. So you can think of this a little bit like accelerating around the corner while you're riding in a car. You tend to lean against your seatbelt. In this case, the walls of the vessel are the seatbelt, and they can stretch out and weaken with so much leaning against them. So here in this circle, we've got multiple sources of arterial blood coming in and feeding into these common vessels. And then we have lots of abrupt changes in vessel direction. So all of this is happening fairly frequently, and that makes the risk for weaknesses forming in these vessels that much higher. And that is going to bring us to the end of the material. For your review question, I would like you to think about, in the event of a blockage of the basilar artery, which other vessel provides a collateral pathway to the posterior cerebral artery? So which of those branches connects to the posterior cerebral artery? The correct answer here is D, the posterior communicating branch. So a good thing to remember with these anastomoses around the circle of Willis, the two big anastomoses both have communicating branch in their names. So the posterior communicating branch runs between the posterior cerebral and the internal carotid, and the anterior communicating runs between the right and left anterior cerebral arteries. Thank you for joining me. That is all she wrote.